Tonight at 10, the deepening hunger crisis in Somalia, which is enduring its worst drought in 40 years. The United Nations is warning 500,000 children under 5 are at risk of death by the middle of next year. We meet one family dealing with the direct impact of climate change.
Before this last drought, Dahir and his family were doing okay. They had fields and crops, they had 6 cows and some goats. They were middle-class farmers, suddenly left destitute, bankrupted by drought.
An international charity says drought has led to the biggest movement of refugees into Kenya in more than a decade. Also on the programme, the government signs a deal with France to try to stop migrants crossing the Channel, but there are doubts about whether it will work. The Ukrainian anthem plays in Kherson as President Zelensky visits the recaptured city for the first time. And the population of the world is projected to reach the landmark figure of 8 billion people.
On BBC London, hospitality workers call for more support for their restaurants, hotels, pubs and cafes amid soaring costs and staff shortages.
Good evening. We start tonight on the continuing hunger crisis in Somalia, which is enduring its worst drought in 40 years. The United Nations is now warning that 500,000 children there under 5 are at risk of death by the middle of next year. The country urgently needs another $1 billion, nearly £850 million in humanitarian aid. Somalia's president has just told the COP27 climate change conference that his country is facing a humanitarian crisis because of extreme weather. As the crisis deepens, our correspondent Andrew Harding has been reporting Somalia's story for this programme. He's returned to the town of Baidoa at the heart of the crisis and the story of one family devastated by the drought. A warning, there are some distressing images of the effects of malnutrition in his report.
We're tearing through Baidoa. Our guards driving faster than on our last visit. The threat of ambushes by Islamist militants is growing here. Suddenly, we stumble across a funeral for a 6-year-old boy who starved to death yesterday. 11 more children were buried here this week. But it's one particular family that's drawn us back to a desolate camp on the edge of town. Fatuma Mohammed is heating breakfast for her children. A cup of tea they'll eat later in the day.
Nice to see you again.
We've returned to see how the family is coping.
Hi, Dahir. How are you?
This was Dahir 6 weeks ago, mourning his younger brother Salat, who died of hunger on the journey into Baidoa. Today, he's in good spirits.
Is Milian feeling hot?
But his 2 sisters are now struggling. They have suspected measles, perhaps pneumonia too. The illnesses that seem to feast on hunger. And which lead so often to this. In a nearby hospital, 2-year-old Naima looks like a burn victim. In fact, her body is reacting painfully to prolonged starvation. As on our visit last month, the ward here is still full of such cases.
Does it feel to you like the world is paying attention now to Somalia?
Now we can say that the attention of the international community is on Somalia, especially the droughts. Yeah.
So you're getting more aid because of that?
We are not getting enough, but we hope to come soon. Actually, it's a desperate situation.
Back at the camp, 11-year-old Dahir is heading to school. He's bright, alert. Our presence may be part of that. But around him, listless children and a chorus of coughing. The teacher tells us most of his class struggle to attend or to focus. Many here will be stunted for life. Across the road, a sudden crowd. A mood of near panic as frustrated mothers try to register for new food handouts. But there's not enough.
It's overwhelming. We are not getting the resources on time with adequate also amount.
So you're only getting half what you need, is that right?
That's exactly what the right picture. We are getting half of what we want.
Later in the day, Fatuma hauls water home for her children. Dahir is quick to help out. I'm getting by, she says, but my children are not well. I must work to make sure they survive.
Somalia is struggling right now, but it's worth remembering that before this last drought, Dahir and his family were doing okay. They had fields and crops, they had 6 cows and some goats. They were middle-class farmers, suddenly left destitute, bankrupted by drought and by climate change.
Inside their hut, the girls slump.
Do you worry about your sisters, Dahir?
Yes.
What do you worry about?
We are straying here towards painful memories of Dahir's brother. I just want my sisters to get better. He says it 3 times. An exhausted Fatuma joins her daughters on their blanket. One family in a nation still overwhelmed by hunger.
I think it is important to acknowledge the huge effort that is being made right now by international humanitarian organisations, by the Somali government and by the vast Somali diaspora. The trouble is the help they're offering is simply not enough. We're in the 5th rainy season in a row that seems to be failing, and we're hearing horrific reports now of women being forced to trek for hundreds of kilometres across the wilderness to leave Somalia altogether to search for food in neighbouring Kenya. Now, we talk about climate change, we talk about the drought, but we also need to focus on conflict. The war here, which has been raging for so many years, is right now escalating even more. And there's no hope of tackling hunger here if that war doesn't come to an end.
Andrew Harding in Somalia, thank you. The UK and France have reached a deal to try to reduce the number of migrants crossing the Channel in small boats. It means UK Border Force officials will be able to observe their French counterparts in control rooms and on beaches. And the number of officers patrolling the French coast will rise by 40% from 250 to 350, costing the UK government an additional £8 million a year. That's on top of the current deal, costing £55 million. The number of migrants who've crossed the Channel in small boats this year topped 40,000 at the weekend. And that's a steep increase on the 28,000 who crossed last year. Back in 2018, only 300 people made a similar crossing when far more came in lorries. Today's deal has been criticised by refugee agencies and by the Conservative MP for Dover. The Home Secretary is describing it as a step forward rather than something that will fix the problem. Our Home Editor Mark Easton reports from Dover.
Around 2,000 migrants have arrived on the Kent coast in the last few days, each individual brought ashore, adding to the pressure on an already under fire Home Secretary to get a grip on what she describes as a migration crisis. As Dover greeted migrant rescue boats, Suella Braverman was in Paris for an early morning signing ceremony with her French counterpart. In her pocket, more money to pay more gendarmes to patrol the Calais beaches and an agreement on closer cooperation. But hold on, Sandhurst? That sign rings a bell. The Sandhurst Treaty was the UK-French security deal signed by Prime Minister Theresa May and President Emmanuel Macron back in 2018. In fact, there have been quite a few deals, each promising to stop small boats leaving the Channel coastline.
In 2018, the UK handed over £45 million for improved security in France. Then the following year, 2019, they handed over £3 million. In 2020, it was £27 million. In 2021, £55 million. And now, another £63 million. So will it make any difference?
In order to solve the problem of illegal migration on the Channel, we take a multi-dimensional approach. There's no single answer, there's no quick fix, there's no silver bullet.
The hope is that embedding UK Border Force observers in the French control centre will make it easier to disrupt attempts to cross the Channel, like this one filmed yesterday by a French fisherman. Dover's MP, though, doesn't think the deal is good enough.
Well, I think this new French agreement unfortunately falls short of the type of action that we need to tackle the small boats crisis. It is an absolutely urgent situation. We do need to see those boats stopped before they leave France.
This morning's arrivals were loaded onto coaches for the 20-mile journey to the processing centre at Manston. Recently criticised by inspectors for wretched conditions, including overcrowding and disease, the Home Office wouldn't say whether the numbers at Manston today remain within legal limits.
This has been going on a very, very long time, and the Home Secretary has said that the asylum system is broken. She's right about that. They broke it. So yes, this is a step in the right direction, but there's so much more that needs to be done.
As things stand, the most effective tool to stop asylum seekers risking their lives to reach the UK is not gendarmes, night vision equipment or embedded Border Force officers. It is the weather. If the seas remain calm enough for the smugglers to operate, thousands more will make the perilous journey. Mark Easton, BBC News, Dover.
Well, let's go live to our correspondent Lucy Williamson, who's in Calais for us. Lucy, is this deal as significant for France as it is for the UK?
Well, I think more resources are always going to be very welcome, more patrols, more equipment, but everyone here is also agreed that it's never going to be the whole solution because of the kind of geography that we're dealing with. The last time I was out on patrol here, the commander said, look, thanks to the UK, we have the drones to spot the smugglers now. We have the vehicles to get to them quickly over the sand dunes. But smugglers will often hide their boats in very inaccessible places, amongst the dunes or in thickets of really high, chest-high, thorny shrubs that tear through uniforms, that tear through skin. And that doesn't make for a quick or stealthy approach. So I think there are lots of people here on the ground who are quite glad at the plan to have British officers here observing alongside them because they think it might make it easier to explain some of the challenges they face. And it's seen as a positive sign politically as well, a sign of warming ties between Paris and London after a tense few years. But that's not to say there aren't some more cynical views as well. There was one official here in Calais who privately suggested to me today that having British officers here, even just as observers, would make it much harder, he said, for the UK to point the finger of blame at France.
Lucy, thank you. Lucy Williamson in Calais. The Ukrainian president has been visiting the city of Kherson days after it was recaptured following the withdrawal of Russian forces. Addressing troops in the city's main square, Volodymyr Zelensky said step by step they are reclaiming the country's invaded territories. Now, the recapture of the city is a strategic setback for Moscow because it was the only regional capital to fall into Russian hands after it invaded Ukraine in February. 30,000 Russian troops have retreated east of the city across the Dnipro River, where they are preparing positions they can more easily defend. In Kherson today, President Zelensky praised the Ukrainian army, saying it had done a great job and the country was moving forwards. Our correspondent James Waterhouse was there.
After everything Kherson's main square has seen, today was more than just a change in the wind. Until just weeks ago, the sight of Ukraine's leader here would have been difficult to imagine. This regional capital is back in its control. He was asked whether it was the beginning of the end of this war.
We are going forward. We're ready for peace, but our peace for our country is all our country, all our territory. We respect the law and respect sovereignty of all the countries, but now we are speaking about our countries.
An undeniable moment in this war.
President Zelensky appearing in the heart of Kherson. That was thought to be in firm Russian control. He has described this as the beginning of the end of the war, and few people here will disagree with that. Ukraine's leader knows there's a lot of fighting and negotiating before that point. For now, Kherson feels like a city emerging from its own lockdown. One place which didn't shut was this grocery shop, run by Valentina and Valentina. We're not sure if it's better because we're just simple people, she says. The most important thing is that we're still alive. So this is a Russian brand of wafer biscuit. And it's kind of a strange legacy of occupation where Valentina's shop is full of stock from Russia. At one point they were forced to accept the Russian ruble, but no more.
They usually paid, but they still carried weapons, which was very scary. My knees were shaking from fear, but I had to keep working. It was so hard. Even now I want to cry.
Some Russian traces are more obvious than others. This used to be the headquarters used by Moscow-installed politicians. It's claimed some people were tortured here if they didn't follow the rules. Ukraine is desperate to achieve peace on its own terms. It is still the underdog, but what's got it this far is knowing what it's fighting for. James Waterhouse, BBC News, Kherson.
The director of the US Foreign Intelligence Service, the CIA, has been holding talks with his Russian counterpart in Turkey in the first known high-level face-to-face talks since Russia invaded Ukraine in February. I'm joined now by our security correspondent, Gordon Correa. How should we interpret today's meeting? How significant is it?
Well, part of the job of spy chiefs is to carry out clandestine or back-channel contacts, but normally those are secret. When I spoke to someone from the CIA this evening, they said they don't comment on the director's travels, but the Russians first confirmed this meeting took place and said that the Americans called for it. Now, it's worth saying that the CIA director, William Burns, is a particularly important messenger. He's a former ambassador to Moscow, knows Putin well. He was the person that President Biden sent to Moscow to warn Russia before the invasion of the consequences and the risks. So I think it is significant they met face-to-face, particularly at this moment in the wake of the fall of Kherson to Ukrainian forces, because the question is, how might Russia respond? Officials in Washington are saying the CIA director is not there to carry out any secret negotiations. That doesn't look likely at the moment, but it does look like he's there to signal a message to Moscow about the risks of it responding by escalating further, for instance, by using a tactical nuclear weapon and signalling that that would have serious consequences. So I think part of his role at this moment is to act as a messenger and also to look for any insight into what Moscow's intentions might be.
Gordon, thank you very much. Gordon Correa there. The US and Chinese presidents have sought to downplay tensions between their countries after meeting face-to-face for the first time since Joe Biden took office. The leaders held talks on the Indonesian island of Bali ahead of the annual G20 summit and agreed common ground on a number of issues, including opposition to the use of nuclear weapons. But they also clashed over the status of Taiwan, which China regards as part of its territory, with President Xi warning President Biden not to cross what he called a red line. With more, here's our North America editor, Sarah Smith.
President Biden looks eager to meet again with a man he always says he knows well. This is his first face-to-face with President Xi as leaders of their nations, but they spent many hours together when they were both vice presidents. Hence the relaxed body language and maybe even a cooperative mood, despite relations between their countries being at their worst for decades. There is much to discuss, from economy, trade and climate change to human rights, the war in Ukraine and, of course, Taiwan. No wonder the meeting lasted for over 3 hours.
As the leaders of our two nations, we share responsibility, in my view, to show that China and the United States can manage our differences, prevent competition from becoming anything ever near conflict.
They agreed nuclear weapons must not be used or even threatened by Russia in Ukraine. The biggest problem is Taiwan. President Xi called it the first red line America must not cross. The recent visit by the senior US politician Nancy Pelosi to the democratic self-governing island enraged Beijing. China responded with military exercises around the island. President Biden today warned his Chinese counterpart against trying to change the island's status, but also told him the US has not changed its policy, which acknowledges Taiwan is part of China. After today's meeting, he said he does not think there will be an imminent attempt to invade Taiwan.
We're going to compete vigorously, but I'm not looking for conflict. I'm looking to manage this competition responsibly. And I want to make sure that every country abides by the international rules of the road. I absolutely believe there need not be a new Cold War.
There was never an expectation of any binding deals coming out of today's meeting. Instead, it was an attempt to lower the temperature, with each country setting out what it will not tolerate from the other, in the hope of preventing disagreement turning into conflict, and to try to avoid a new Cold War. Sarah Smith, BBC News.
On Thursday, the Chancellor Jeremy Hunt will announce his autumn statement. He's warned that we will all be paying more tax and that some of the cuts required are eye-watering. Tens of billions of pounds are set to be clawed back, but exactly how to do that while trying to grow the economy at the same time isn't easy. Our economics editor Faisal Islam is here. So what are some of the major issues the government is facing, Faisal?
Yes, Tina, this is a very unusual Chancellor's statement, a type of rescue budget after a massive energy shock. This is how big. In 2019, the UK as a whole, that's households, companies and government, spent about £40 billion on its energy bill. This year, it's up fourfold, so £190 billion. And that increase is basically like having to fund another NHS. That cost can't be shouldered by household, and it's the government's job to share the pain around. Pain that the Prime Minister acknowledges has also been made worse by his predecessor.
On the steps of Downing Street, I said that mistakes had been made. A part of the reason that I became Prime Minister was to address them. And what we've seen now is that stability has returned to the United Kingdom. But that's because the expectation is that the government will make those difficult but necessary decisions.
And those difficult decisions are likely to include significant spending cuts. Take infrastructure investments, things like buildings, roads and railways. That's set to be pushed back, the spending. A potentially easy way for the Treasury to find saving. And if cut back to closer to sort of £50 billion a year, rather than the £70 billion a year it's at around now, that's many billions in savings while still leaving spending well above the average of the previous Labour government, for example. But the government's own infrastructure czar told me that priorities such as levelling up were at risk from flip-flopping over investment like this.
Well, it is very important for levelling up, and particularly in the Midlands and the North, and therefore I would hope that we will not see things like the integrated rail plan being shelved, or indeed HS2, because I think they can play a vital part in levelling up.
Then there's tax rises of a sort. A significant widening of the net is expected. Over most of the past decade and a half, the number of UK taxpayers has remained remarkably constant at around 31 million. Within that, the number paying the higher rate has been around 4 million. This has been by design, the result since 2010 of Conservative policy to up thresholds, the point at which each of these bands of tax start, significantly. But now that's in total reverse, with the new policy to freeze those bands for years. And as a result, the total number of taxpayers is heading for 35 million by 2026 and 36 million if extended again on Thursday. Meanwhile, the number of higher rate taxpayers, well, that could double to over 8 million by 2028. The end result on Thursday, lots more tax revenue from a much wider tax net of taxpayers. So tough decisions on spending and tax, some pushed into the future past 2025, past the election, an acknowledgement of the balancing act between credibly making the numbers add up and not worsening an immediate recession. Tina.
Faisal, thank you. Ahead of Thursday's autumn statement, the Prime Minister is in Bali at the G20 Summit of World Leaders. Our political editor, Chris Mason, is also there. Chris, this is a defining week for the Prime Minister.
Yeah, good morning to you, Tina, from Bali. The new day beginning here, the summit getting underway in just a couple of hours. And yes, it is a defining week for the Prime Minister, because for all of his self-inflicted human resources grief of his early weeks in office, the whole business of hiring Suella Braverman as Home Secretary, the now departed Gavin Williamson, on the economic front, things have been relatively calm. Now, the argument from the Prime Minister on the plane here was to say that the reason it has been calm is because he has been talking about all of this bad news budget, as many will see it, coming up on Thursday. In other words, to be seen as credible internationally on those international financial markets, there have to be those tough decisions on spending and on tax. But the reality of that, politically for him and for millions of households more importantly, is that things are going to be really, really tough. Now, we had a further hint on the journey here that the government will protect the state pension, that it will continue to rise in line with inflation, with prices. But beyond that, huge scope for grim headlines in just a couple of days. The government is aware of that. They're trying to lay the ground and prepare us for it. In many ways, I think by the end of this week, we'll feel that it is the proper start of Rishi Sunak as Prime Minister.
Chris Mason, thank you. Over the course of the week, there will be lots more information on the autumn statement on the BBC website, including Tackling It Together, which brings programmes, brands and experts together to offer help navigating the cost of living crisis. You can find out more at bbc.co.uk/news and by using the BBC News app. Now, a look at some other stories making the news today. The mother of a baby boy allegedly murdered by a nurse has told a court she heard her son's cry and it was like nothing she'd heard before. The prosecution claims the mother walked into the hospital room in Chester as an attack on the infant was in progress. Lucy Letby denies murdering 7 newborns and attempting to murder 10 others. The clothing group Joules has announced it's calling in administrators after failing to secure emergency investment, putting around 1,600 jobs at risk. The Leicestershire-based company has over 130 high street shops. Founder Tom Joules says he hopes restructuring the business model could enable the brand to survive on a smaller scale. The King celebrated his 74th birthday today, his first as monarch. There were no public engagements planned, but an official portrait has been released showing His Majesty standing beside an ancient oak tree in Windsor. The global population is projected to hit a new all-time high tomorrow, reaching the landmark figure of 8 billion people. That's according to the United Nations. The world's population has doubled in less than 50 years and is set to keep rising. Our medical editor Fergus Walsh has been examining the figures and what it means for us all.
Our planet has never held so many people as the era of huge population growth continues. Back in 1800, there were around 1 billion people on Earth, and it took over a century for that to double. Then it really took off in the 20th century, reaching 3 billion in 1960 and putting on nearly 1 billion each decade after that. It reached 7 billion in 2011. We're now set to hit 8 billion people on the planet. So what about the future? The UN projects there'll be 9 billion people by around 2037 and 10 billion by 2058. Global population could peak at around 10.4 billion in the 2080s and then plateau before declining in the next century. The United Nations says more than half the projected population increase to 2050 will be in just 8 countries. Half of them are in sub-Saharan Africa. Indeed, the total population of this entire region is set to almost double to 2 billion by 2050. Remember, it includes some of the world's least developed countries, many already experiencing food insecurity. India and China are the world's most populous countries. Both are home to more than 1.4 billion people. But India will overtake China next year. China's population, along with scores of other countries, is set to fall sharply later this century. Now that's because global fertility is declining dramatically. Back in 1950, women gave birth on average to 5 children. That has since more than halved to 2.3 births, and it's set to fall even further. But there are so many people of childbearing age now, that explains why the global population will keep rising for much of this century. Another reason is we're living longer. Average global life expectancy reached almost 73 years in 2019, up almost 9 years since 1990. COVID actually pushed it down by nearly 2 years, but it's projected to keep rising. The world's population is also aging. About 1 in 10 people on the planet is now 65 or older. By 2050, it'll be almost 1 in 6, so that will put a greater burden on the young. Our growing population also puts increasing pressure on resources, food, water, energy, as well as infrastructure. Huge issues for society with lasting implications for our planet.
Fergus Walsh, our medical editor there. It's time now for a look at the weather with Louise Lear, and it's starting to feel like it should in November.
We had fog, didn't we? I mean, November, I always think of fog. First thing in November. Hello, everybody. If you're watching the 6 o'clock news, you'll have seen that I did show a beautiful picture of blue sky and sunshine in Cornwall. And look at this. It looked quite innocent to close out the day, but this actually is a weather front that's going to bring some very wet and very windy weather with it. Here it is on the satellite picture, on the bigger picture, and you can see how extensive that cloud is, all tied into an area of low pressure that's moving in as we speak. Now, over the next few hours, it's going to be the winds that potentially are going to be more significant than the rain to begin with. So we're likely to see gusts of winds in excess of 50, 60, maybe as much as 65 miles an hour in 1 or 2 spots, driving that rain quite quickly through. But first thing in the morning, the heaviest of the rain will be across parts of Hampshire, Dorset, stretching up into the Midlands and into East Wales. And that will gradually move its way into northwest England and then push its way steadily eastwards into northeast England and Scotland by the afternoon. Behind it, quite a clearance. In actual fact, not a bad day in prospect across Northern Ireland and parts of Wales and southeast England. A cluster of sharp showers being driven in by some pretty blustery winds. But it's Monday, it's the afternoon in Tuesday. Across the far north, it'll see the gusts of winds in excess of 50 miles an hour. And in terms of the feel of the weather, actually, this is where we should be at this time of year, around 11 to 14 Celsius as our afternoon highs. Now, if you take away anything from this set of frontal systems, it's basically that we are going to stay unsettled. Plenty of isobars on the chart, low pressure in control, plenty of rain to come. A little bump of high pressure just ridging in on Friday. So on the whole, it stays unsettled, it stays windy at times. Best of the day's weather is likely to be Friday. Tina.
Louise, thank you. And that's BBC News at 10 on the 14th of September. There's more analysis of the day's main stories on Newsnight with Kirsty Wark, which is just getting underway on BBC Two. The news continues here on BBC One, as now it's time to join our colleagues across the nations and regions for the news where you are. But from the 10 team, it's good night.